Hi, I'm Chandler McCoy with the Getty Conservation Institute, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. What modernist architect doesn't want a museum commission? Airports and hotels and building offices for tech pros are nice gigs, but museums are the most lucrative and high-profile projects an architect can get. Budgets are big, backers are rich, publicity is guaranteed, and most of the time, clients want the architect to fully self-express their wildest plans. It's a good deal for the museum, too, as they get to brag about their remarkable new building. Joining us today is museum design expert Andras Szanto, author of The Future of Museums and Imagining the Future Museum. And here's your host, often found inside museums, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. You know you're a diehard architecture fan when you visit a museum just for the buildings.
Yes.
Never mind they are meaningful and historic works of art, rare books, giant dinosaur skeletons, or pensive sculptures everywhere. You, as an architecture fan, want to experience the space, the vibe, the way the sun comes through in the daytime, and how well the lighting people design the nighttime. You notice how well the lobby is designed for what can be massive amounts of visitors. How easily will people move through the building's levels? How invisible are the security guards? And are they in those awful museum blazers, 2 sizes too large? How easy is it to find the restrooms? I had the privilege of visiting the Museum of the Future in Dubai last year, one of the most extraordinary buildings in the world. Please Google it. Entering the lobby, one is faced with perhaps 300 people in what looks like chaos. Then you realize someone has thought this through. A scanner reads your ticket. A helpful guide puts you in a long line, and you sigh at the wait. Then, magically, the line moves rocket fast as you discover they are putting you in huge elevators to go up many levels and work your way down. The elevators are tricked out with surround sound screens to simulate launching you into space.
Really?
So by the time you reach the top floor, you're essentially in their version of a space station. So cool. No matter which modernist museum you go to, though, one thing you can count on, always, the gift shop will be obvious.
Yes.
Museums have learned from Disney and casinos that exhibitions should always end where you can get a t-shirt. Been there, done that, size large, please. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Andras Szanto advises museums around the world and the people who give large donations to museums around the world. A graduate of the PhD program in sociology at Columbia, he has written for the New York Times, ArtForum, and Art newspaper, and has overseen the National Arts Journalism program at Columbia and the Global Museum Leaders Colloquium at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. His latest books are The Future of Museums, which interviews 28 of the world's leading museum directors, and Imagining the Future Museum, 21 conversations with prominent museum architects. And just by pure luck, George recently met Andras at U.S. Modernist Moon Over Modernism event in L.A. So welcome back to the show, Andras.
It's a pleasure.
So Andras, did you enjoy the party we had at the Harvey House in Los Angeles?
It was terrific. People were great. Food was great, but the view was the best.
It is pretty super, isn't it? That, what, like 280-degree view of Los Angeles?
Just when you think you've seen it all in LA, there's some hidden treasure, and it was really a very special day to be there.
Now, what had you be out there that weekend? Because you're normally in New York.
We had just concluded an event in Northern California, which is about bringing together museum directors with the technology sector and with each other to sort of grapple with what technology is doing in the museum sphere. And following that, I came down with a wonderful colleague of ours who is a philanthropist who's also working with museums. And we were going to be having meetings over at LACMA the next day. So it was a very lucky coincidence that I happened to be in LA on the day of your party. And she was one of your many invitees who was intrigued by this event and had us come along. So it was really lucky coincidence.
So you were her date.
Yeah, sort of.
In a sense, the two of us were there with a colleague, but we had a great time.
Now, let's go back in time. The year is 1950. What are most museums like in 1950?
Well, most museums, first of all, are going to be not all around the world. Probably in 1950, we're looking at a European museum or a North American museum. And by then, we, of course, have few of our modern museum buildings, but when it comes to their buildings, many of them, strangely enough, in a kind of unquestioned way, look like Greek temples.
Very classical.
Very classical.
I don't think that's an accident.
It isn't hardly an accident. They are emerging from a long history. Actually, not that long, strangely enough. Museums are really only a few hundred years old the way we sort of understand them to be as public institutions. But since they were coming out of Europe in the 18th and 19th century, people believed in something they then called, and today sounds rather anachronistic, high culture. And by that, they meant something that would be originating in the sort of classical world of Greece and Rome, in particular Greece as this sort of paragon of civilization as it was seen then. And so when countries started building their own sort of temples of the muses, they were emulating the Greek model, and they were building something that looked like the Parthenon and many other Greek and Roman temples. And they were often actually on a hill and high up. And what that was supposed to signal was that these were extremely authoritative institutions where you could experience high culture and gain knowledge and interact with sort of the best of civilization. And so the building became a kind of metaphor of a certain idea of culture, which has changed a lot since then.
You made a reference to temples of the muses. Is that possibly the etymological origin of the word museum?
Yeah, I mean, it all goes back to the muses for sure.
Uh-huh.
But, by today, we are a long way away from this kind of rather romantic, idealized version of the museum. Museums have become so much more than that. But back in 1950, I think museum culture was, the buildings were one thing, but museum culture was a rather stern affair. I mean, my first experience of museums were in the early 70s, but even then, you were supposed to keep your voice down. It was a place where, you went in and you were expected to adopt a kind of posture of serious contemplation and interaction with very important knowledge.
Kind of like a library.
Like a library, like a concert hall. But all of these were products of the Enlightenment, really. But mainly it was a kind of very serious thing. And quite frankly, one of the things that we would notice today is that the people who went to them were either experts and the sort of actual custodians of art and these art objects who were there for a kind of research purpose, or typically from the higher classes. And there was always a strain of the idea of the democratic museum and a museum that should be opened up to a much broader public. But a lot of that history really only played out after the 60s and 70s.
And when Andras did the architecture turn more modern, was that with the Guggenheim by Frank Lloyd Wright in New York, or did it happen before then?
Well, I mean, the mid-century is when these museums started taking on new forms broadly. I mean, I think if you were to look at two paradigms of this kind of modernist form, you would look at Mies van der Rohe's sort of black slab of a cube museum in Berlin, the Neue National Gallery, the New National Gallery, recently refurbished by David Chipperfield in an extremely respectful way. You can barely notice he was there. And this is one of the great icons, not only of museum architecture, but of modernist architecture as such. Mies, of course, then widely emulated here in America. And then, of course, we have the sort of homegrown modernism of America embodied in Frank Lloyd Wright, and probably the world's best known museum structure, this corkscrew of a building dating to the 1950s, which was a bit more organic and, was a different take on modernism, but nonetheless really far away from those classicist structures. It should be noted that great modernist museums are also being built in Latin America, really all around the world. But from the middle of this century onward, when we began also to venerate modern art over old art, the museums also began increasingly to take on a modern form, to become emblems of the kind of art that we were increasingly worshiping in them. Because let's not forget that the idea of the museum being home to contemporary art is also a relatively new thing. But by the 1950s, and certainly the 60s, 70s, and on, what people were flocking to museums, art museums, to see increasingly were the art of today, which at the time was modern art. So these museums increasingly were being built for modern artists. Less so in Mies's case. I suppose those were avant-garde artists at the time. But then another game changer was the Centre Pompidou in Paris. The assumption was that if you're going to walk in there, you're not going to be looking at, busts from antiquity or wooden depictions of saints, but you were going to come there for big, probably abstract art. So the form fit the content. But we dropped this sort of classicist vernacular in the mid-century. But I would like to say that just because we dropped one language of authority doesn't mean that we didn't continue to speak with the language of authority. So museums, being in many ways the replacements for the church in secular society, have always been built to the sort of highest architectural aspirations. I think it's fair to say that the biggest thing you can do as an architect is to build a museum. Maybe your country's parliament is sort of along the same lines. But what we ended up getting, and really it starts in many ways with the Guggenheim, were these no less awe-inspiring structures, but this time created in the language of modernist architecture rather than a classicist architecture.
And then more and more cities, not big cities, but places like Indianapolis or Wichita or
Milwaukee, Akron, Ohio, you can name them all.
Right. Started building their own more modern buildings in the 60s and 70s. And then we started to go into that phase where the old classical museums started to get very innovative with modernist additions or changes. And I'm thinking specifically about I.M. Pei's Visitor Center at the Louvre. That was a real turning point, wasn't it?
100%. I think there's a couple of things that were going on. So one was the modifications and the additions to museums, which are necessary because museums, as they began to open up to a wider audience, the first blockbuster exhibitions are really in the 1970s, and this whole idea that the success of a museum was measured by its audience sort of dated from that. Former director of the Met wrote, as you know, a famous book, a memoir called Making the Mummies Dance. This was Hoeing. He was the first person to put a banner on a museum. This whole idea of the museum becoming a popular attraction took hold. But then, of course, you had to accommodate those audiences. And so indeed, you began to get the extensions. And I think I.M. Pei was tremendously influential both in Europe and here in the United States, because let's not forget his extraordinary addition to the National Gallery, which was also is a remarkable building currently undergoing renovation. And then, of course, you've got your pyramid in the Louvre. But that story, the Louvre pyramid, I think, begins to take us in another chapter of this story, which is this whole idea of almost thematic architecture, architecture that is sort of making its own statement, architecture where the architecture of the museum almost begins to be more important than the museum itself, more recognized by the general public, and begins to sort of elbow out the contents of the museum. The antecedents of this, certainly, I think the Louvre pyramid was so incredible that this object could suddenly be sitting there in the courtyard of the Louvre. It was like something out of outer space, but it wasn't separated in time by too many years from the Centre Pompidou in Paris, which was, of course, this factory-like inside-out building that nobody had ever seen anything like it before, also attracting tremendous attention and sort of pilgrimages from people. And then ultimately, the extreme example, the apex of this being Frank Gehry's Guggenheim Bilbao. And at that point, what you began to see was not only that great architecture could attract people to a museum that already exists, but the formula that began to be seen, including by some of these American cities, is that if you put in a sufficiently flamboyant museum by an internationally renowned architect, you can sort of, as the saying goes, put your city on the map, because that's what happened in Bilbao.
It even has a name, right? It's called the Bilbao effect.
It was the so-called Bilbao effect. Bilbao is, by the way, a lovely city. I highly recommend it. I would recommend it even without the Guggenheim, but most people who are tourists didn't go there. And indeed, it did fulfill that function. I think that it did put Bilbao on the map. And then everybody else said, well, we need one of these. And we had really a couple of decades of tremendous architectural efflorescence. I think this is one of the greatest eras in many ways in architecture, where the great architects of the day, Gehry, Jean Nouvel, Herzog de Meuron, many others, were sort of given free rein to their creativity, because the whole idea was to create these sort of city-defining ornaments that would attract a lot of people, often to cities which sort of felt that they needed something like that as a kind of magnet for visitors, especially for visitors.
Now, going back to the Louvre and IMP, I mean, the pyramid gets all the attention because it was the aesthetic component of the project. But the real magic there, I thought, was this vast underground complex visitors center, which was going to, hold the more mundane things like the snack bar and the bathrooms and where you get your strollers and where you buy your tickets and the gift shop and all those kinds of ancillary things that modern museums have to have. Was that the first time that somebody had pushed all that kind of stuff underground?
So here I would say I'm not an architecture historian, so there are probably examples well before that. But I think it certainly established a model because it was so widely seen and emulated. And there are many reasons for that. One was that indeed a lot of these buildings needed to be armed with amenities that were simply missing before. And by the way, lining up at the Louvre didn't become so much nicer even after the pyramid. I think many of us have had that experience. It was still sucked. But now they're addressing it a bit more because, by the way, how do you really fix that problem? How about staying open late, which only the current director of the Louvre is beginning to open up that possibility to just stretch out the number of people in the course of the day. But I digress. There are many reasons why those functions needed to go to the bottom. One of them was that architects and museums wanted to stop people having to climb up first because they wanted to bring the museum down to the level of the street. And this was part of that gambit. And then there were other reasons. Most of these truly important museums find themselves in historically protected areas. So the idea of just like, hey, let's build a new wing next to the Louvre is a little bit difficult because you would be intervening in this incredibly delicate and highly protected ecology. It's a miracle that they got Paris to agree to that pyramid. But many museums around the world find themselves in, particularly the most ranking museums, in circumstances where even if you wanted to, you couldn't just sort of add another wing. Either there's no space or historical protections wouldn't let you to do it. So I think there are a number of reasons. It also works really well from sort of visitor flow standpoint. But what is for sure is that many museums, the ones that used to have stairs leading up to it, many of them began to look for ways to put these functions on the ground floor, in the basement, so that people could enter closer to the ground, making it easier for groups, making it easier for disabled. I mean, there's a million reasons why. And so we began to have this sort of subterranean world. By the way, let's not forget, many of those buildings also had subterranean facilities that were able to be repurposed.
Yeah, one of the things about going downstairs in the Louvre is that you also wind up seeing the base of the castle that was the Louvre before it became a museum. It's something that I think was maybe not accessible to the public before it was excavated, along with the restaurants and the coat check and all of that. But it's pretty cool. It's another feature to see down there.
Again, these very old classic museums have often gone on a kind of scavenge hunt for previously unused spaces. And it turns out there's quite a lot of space in a 18th, 19th century building that you can repurpose. There are spaces under stairs. There are basements that perhaps are no longer fulfilling their prior functions. There are air shafts that were necessary in the days when museums had natural ventilation. If you go to the Met, there's an absolutely wonderful, often missed, recently installed period room, the Rockefeller dressing room, which is there because it happened to be the exact same size as an air shaft that was no longer needed. And today you experience it as a period room, but it used to have this old function that was no longer needed in the age of air conditioning.
You advise a lot of museum directors around the world. What is their most common mistake, Andras? I'm guessing it's something along the lines of they're so in love with what they exhibit that they don't think that strategically. Is that close?
Well, if I was in a funny mood, I would say their most common mistake is not listening to their strategic advisors, but I'm not going to say that. I think actually, I don't want to talk about the mistakes of individual directors, because I think if you read particularly that first book with museum directors, they're working really hard to change perceptions around museums. I think the field as a whole has had a lot of growing pains, leaving behind its fundamentally elitist roots and truly opening up and truly positioning itself as an institution that is there for everybody in the community. There was a tremendous reckoning around that in the pandemic. But I would say that today's generation of museum directors are really working to open up the museum, make it more welcoming, make it a more lateral rather than a hierarchical institution. But, it's very, very hard to unscramble the omelet. Another piece of this is getting rid of the sort of colonialist legacies of the museum. This is particularly true of European museums, which are often in countries that had large colonial empires.
We can think specifically of like the Elgin marbles.
I was going to say.
That the British Museum has been keeping for a while from Greece.
Yes, well, more recently we've been hearing about the looted bronzes from Benin, which are being returned, and there are hundreds of them, and they're all in museums all around Europe, Germany, France, England, some here. But they're getting over this colonial legacy is not just about giving stuff back, because there's a lot of stuff that should never have been here. There's also a lot of stuff that was perfectly legally acquired. But there are other elements of that, which is what is the picture of the culture that you are projecting in your museum? So when you arrive at a major museum, let's say, and you are invited to walk up 3 sets of stairs to arrive straight into the European painting galleries, you are making a statement about your conception of how culture works. They are at the heart of the museum. Whereas if you, let's say, wanted to see the Asian stuff, well, you're going to have to walk pretty far down to the other end of the building. And these are the things that are very, very hard to undo, very costly, very difficult. And so particularly for museums that have been collecting all of history, there's a lot of rewriting to be done, because as we are learning in general in our society, history has been written by the winners in a certain way, and there is a kind of generational effort to undo that. And some of that is around the scholarship. A lot of it is around what gets collected to begin with. A lot of it is what are the stories that will be told with those objects. And indeed, some of it is about the architecture, because there's an awful lot that architecture can do to change the message of the museum, the tonality of the museum. That sense of openness and welcome is something that you can project through the right kind of architecture. And even in terms of how you frame the collection and how you enable a more complex viewing experience of these collections.
I was wondering, have you ever seen the movies Night at the Museum?
Yeah, I've done that.
Is there any museum you'd like to spend the night in?
Well, right now, my top contender would be the brand new wing of the Natural History Museum here in Manhattan, which just this week is opening an incredible addition by Studio Gang, architectural office from Chicago. So as it happens, that would be a really nice place to be. But I have spent a night in a museum.
Oh, tell me.
Actually. So a museum that really needs to be on everyone's bucket list, a cluster of museums, which are in Naoshima Island in Japan, which I never tire of telling people it is one of the hardest places to get to. You have to take a plane, and then a train, and then a boat, and then a bike, and then you walk, and then you get there.
I hope they have a snack bar.
Yeah, that's right.
They have a very good snack bar. They have also a couple of excellent restaurants. But one of the things they have is in their main building, which is called Benesse House, they have a hotel inside, combined with this world-class museum, Tadeyondo building. And actually, there's also, in addition to the main hotel, a little cluster of rooms, I think 9 rooms arranged around an oval, encircling a water feature in a little hill that you can access by opening a tiny door in the museum where you find a little funicular, little tram that goes up the hill. And that is where we stayed with my wife, and it was one of my most unforgettable.
What's the name of this place again?
This is Naoshima, and it is really probably one of the world's most beautiful museum experiences because there are a number of entities created on this island. This used to be an island for industrial waste, and the owner gradually transformed it as this kind of bucket list, once in a lifetime pilgrimage inducing destination for architecture. Your organization should take people there because it's also one of the highest embodiments of modernism that you can find. It's really Tadeyondo's masterpiece. And next to it is another island with more art stuff on it, but it is actually the only example that I have of an actual functioning hotel. There used to be a temporary hotel attached to the Palais de Tokyo, which is a large modern museum in Paris. And I'm sure your listeners might know of other examples. I think the combination of museum and hotel is a really good one, particularly if you think about rural destinations. And in many ways, you could say that you have examples in historic houses and so on. I'm a big advocate of attaching other functions to museums, and I think hotels are a really good thing to do.
Are you familiar, Andras, with, I think it's called C21 Museum Hotels, the chain around the country?
Yes, I stayed in one recently in Bentonville, Arkansas. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah.
Of a place that's off the beaten path, but a real get for a museum lover.
We have one here in Durham, North Carolina, and there, I guess, a dozen of them or so around the country.
Yeah.
They're more hotel than museum, but they have that kind of vibe.
They do. And there's a whole category of art hotels. I once even wrote an article about art hotels. And, we have actually advised the only sort of museum-like space in Las Vegas, which is the largest city in America not to have a museum, an art museum. But the only art museum style space is the gallery inside the Bellagio Hotel. Over the years that we have advised them as well. So you can see wonderful exhibitions there. But, it kind of goes to our larger point about the transformation of museums, that they don't have to be these isolated temples on the hill, that there are ways that we can integrate the idea of the museum and the larger idea of appreciation of art in buildings. And we can knit that idea into the city, that it doesn't have to be a 16-hour plane trip and a train and a boat. And, and there's a place for that kind of almost magical, mystical, even spiritual type of art pilgrimage. But there really ought to be and has to be a place for opportunities to experience art as part of your daily life. And there's only 2 ways you can do that. Either you bring the art into those spaces of daily life, a hotel, outdoors, public life, or by bringing daily life into the museum. And one of the reasons I keep advocating that museums would be wonderful co-working spaces, or can be, among many other things. Why should somebody with a laptop sit at a horrible Starbucks when they can be in a beautiful museum, work for a few hours, enjoy the air conditioning, get a cup of coffee, maybe go see some art if they're tired? Seems to me a wonderful thing to do. Many museums, let's face it, we talk about these famous museums, which have millions of visitors, but most museums around the country on a Wednesday afternoon, let's say at 3:00, aren't exactly teeming with visitors. So
Yeah.
in our work, we talk a lot now about the museum as a third space, a museum that's sort of the living room of the community, and that there's nothing wrong with that. Quite the opposite. If we habituate people to sort of see the museum as their kind of urban oasis where they spend their time, and where, among other things, they can also take in culture and talks and events and education and so on, then I think we have a really winning formula. If we want to do this sort of totally pristine museums that are just about one object in some room, we're going to run out of road.
30 years ago, the North Carolina Museum of Art was headed by a fellow named Larry Wheeler, and it was located on a former prison site outside of Raleigh. Very nice Edward Durrell stone building, but not exactly, exploding with fireworks out there. It was not the most exciting place to go. And Larry did something that was pretty much criticized at the time. He built an amphitheater.
That's right.
On the grounds.
That's right.
And started having concerts there April through October, which just completely energized the campus and brought in tens of thousands of younger people and new patrons to the museum. And for me, I see that as one of the most significant developments in that museum being able to build a brand new edition by Thomas Pfeiffer and expand its programs and go to what it's in today. What are some other very innovative steps you've seen museums make in the U.S.?
Well, I think the discovery of outdoors, by the way, has been one of those pandemic era legacies, and lucky museums were the ones that actually had parks around them. A lot of the great ideas have been with us for a long time, that they weren't always appreciated. We have phenomenal museums with gardens. Just last week, on that same visit where I saw you, we stopped by at the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena, which is one of the most glorious gardens you can find in a museum. One of our clients, the Nelson Atkins in Kansas City, is surrounded by this glorious park and sculpture park. There are numerous other examples. The activation of outdoor spaces is very important, not just because, once in our lifetimes we had a pandemic, but also because these are what we call low threshold experiences. Nobody is that afraid to walk into a park. The museum, unfortunately, still remains a high threshold experience. So the more we can do around the museum, get people to sort of enjoy the museum as this larger thing, the more likely we can also get people into the museum. But look, we've had a lot of innovations. We talked about bringing the museum down to the ground floor. The Brooklyn Museum did that in the 1930s already. The incredible innovations around museum restaurants, around all the retrofitting of museums to accommodate all kinds of modern art, which hadn't been able to come in there before. A lot of people were unhappy about it at the time, but the idea of the franchised museum, a museum that doesn't have to be only in one location, as Guggenheim started building Guggenheims around the world. Guess what? That idea is alive and well, even within the same city. LACMA in Los Angeles is now building satellites around the city, which is a sprawling city. So there are all kinds of new considerations, including climate change. My second book was full of revelations about new ideas. You mentioned earlier about underground construction. In an era of climate change, when there's so much concern about energy consumption, the idea of building galleries underground is being, given a second look. But perhaps the biggest one of all is the one that you started with. You started by saying there used to be a prison where this museum was. I actually think that one of the great architectural innovations, certainly of museums, is their willingness to engage in what we call adaptive reuse. I always say, we in the art world, we will take anything. You give us a grain silo, you give us an old electric power plant, an old prison, a former school, a hospital, we'll take it. We'll turn it into a museum.
An island full of waste.
Yes.
An island full of waste. And good for us because, A, these buildings carry a lot of history. Singapore's National Gallery is in its old courthouse. Now, love it or hate it, but there's a lot of history that comes with that, a lot of sort of DNA. But more importantly, with construction now being recognized as the world's most polluting industry, the idea that we have this history of repurposing buildings rather than always necessarily building new buildings is a real plus. And I see tremendous opportunities for continuing to do so. And same with urban revitalization, which again, I think museums have been at the forefront of really innovative thinking of like, hey, rather than putting this museum in a Gold Coast part of town, let's put it in a part of town that needs to come up. That's what happened in Barcelona. It has happened in Bilbao. It actually happened even in Paris. The Centre Pompidou was in a not very good part of town. So this idea that museums can be a progressive force in urban planning is, again, I think something we can be proud of and something we should be doing more of.
Now, our organization, with the exception of this podcast, is all online with our digital library of architecture magazines. We've got about 4 million pages now. And we're trying to raise money for an endowment fund, so this project goes on along beyond me. So as a professional consultant, can you give us any advice on how to do this, Andras? Because, we're all ears, like Ross Perot used to say.
We're about to experience the greatest intergenerational wealth transfer in history. And I think there's an awful lot of money out there, and it doesn't grow on trees. But one advantage you have is a somewhat unique mission. And all you need is a couple of people who get really passionate about it. And it can solve a lot of problems. One of the things that our field grapples with, all of the cultural field, is making sure that we explain our value proposition properly. But I think if you can make the case for the public value of something, I do think that here in the United States, there's just a tremendous wealth that is drawn to great ideas. We see this over and over again. When there's an institution that has good leadership, strong sense of mission, it can raise tremendous amounts of money. We've recently been working in cities in the interior of the United States, cities like Akron, Ohio, Kansas City. And what you see is that if there's a strong sense of something adding value to a community, and if there's a strong visionary at the helm of that, the resources can be found. So that may not be the answer you're waiting for. Maybe you were asking me to come up with some amazing revenue generating idea.
Yeah, do you have anybody in your Rolodex?
Having been to your event, I know that you're already doing a pretty darn good job of tapping into those types of opportunities in a very entrepreneurial way. But I think philanthropy will certainly be part of your future.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for chatting with us. This has been a real pleasure.
It really has. And all the best with your work, and look forward to reconnecting at one of your really glorious parties.
Okay. Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Okay, Tom, to you for the layup.
They call me Hawkeye. Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 20,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.2 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with Kelly Policelli on guest research. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I will be back soon with another museum-quality edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.
And stop by our gift shop on the way out.